In 2020, EFSA identified the need to develop a roadmap for action on building a European partnership for next-generation systems-based environmental risk assessment, PERA, referring to new scientific developments, societal demands, and policy targets as drivers of change. This presentation shows an overview of the PERA project, developed by a consortium of 8 institutions led by the University of Coimbra. Although the transition to systems-based approaches in environmental risk assessment is not constrained to single regulated substances, but aims at overcoming regulatory silos, to prioritize efforts and help the establishment of PERA as a pilot initiative, the work of this project is focused on pesticides. This presentation is structured around providing answers to 3 main questions. Why? Why do we need a systems-based approach for environmental risk assessment? Where to? Present a vision on what could be this systems-based approach based on the information gathered during the project from multiple sources. And last, how and who? Our ideas on how to achieve it and who should be involved in this process. But before going directly into the main questions, some brief words about the methodology used. A co-creation approach was adopted during the entire project. Information was collected from different sources to build a vision of a systems-based approach. An extensive desk research was conducted about the different type of actors and their activities, identifying existing and potential partnerships and areas requiring further development for the transition to a systems-based era. Information was complemented by conducting semi-structured interviews to key stakeholders, designing to identify possibilities for new constellations of collaborations, as well as to perceive challenges and blockers for transitioning to a new systems-based era. The developed vision was then presented at 2 dedicated workshops. The aim was to collect the first impressions on the vision and to establish a community to support the roadmap for the transition to a systems-based era. And now starting with the first question. Why do we need a shift in paradigm? Why do we need a systems-based approach for ERA? We are aware that despite the improvements in regulation, current ERA processes are not capable of preventing environmental issues of concern, namely biodiversity loss. We can ask ourselves, are we protecting the environment as much as we would like or should when dealing with risks of regulated chemicals, namely pesticides? To where do we want to go? Currently, we have a fragmented regulatory landscape with conceptually different approaches that could lead to inconclusive decisions and assessments. So, we need to increase the dialogue between these regulatory silos and harmonize regulatory approaches, move towards the one substance, one assessment. We also know that organisms are submitted to different stressors. Although the environmental risk assessment needs to be simplified, it should not be simplistic in a way that it should embrace environmental complexity. Furthermore, ERA frameworks should be in line with scientific advances and with policy and societal needs that demand more sustainable solutions to protect the environment. More holistic approaches are needed. So, we believe that the systems-based approach for ERA helps tackling all these issues by looking at problem formulation and defining protection goals in a holistic way, by considering possible implications of decisions and proposing alternative solutions, by combining information from different scientific disciplines, and by involving different actors in the discussion process. But we can say that the transition process towards a more holistic approach of tackling these issues and leading towards a greener, more sustainable environment is already advancing. At high political level, we have the European Green Deal as the big umbrella, and the associated strategies like the Farm to Fork, the Chemical Strategy for Sustainability, the Biodiversity Strategy, the Soil Strategy. All these are in fact pointing into a direction of a more holistic view of environmental problems, including risk assessment of chemicals. Then of course we have the EFSA strategic goals and associated ongoing activities already working towards an holistic approach for pesticide ERA. We have the Must Be project, the Roadmap for Pollinators, and the NTA project INAS. Then of course we have different projects and programs already aligned with this approach. The Spring and Water projects, and some projects under the Biodiversity Plus program. Plus, it would be important to mention existing partnerships like PARC that is already planning to develop a lot of initiatives that can help on this transition. But coming back to the why question, the pictogram in this slide tries to show why we need a change in perspective. This illustrates the perspective of the current regulatory system for pesticides. We can see that it's a very fragmented system. We have individual assessments for individual organisms or organism groups, but also individual assessments of individual substances. But they are all affecting the same agricultural ecosystem. And then, on top of that, we have other agricultural regulations which affect the agricultural production system. And again, it is all really affecting the same system. So, all these regulations and different assessments seems to be very loosely linked. This can sometimes lead to an uncoordinated or even conflicting decision with regards to environmental or agricultural production management. And, as mentioned before, there is a loss of biodiversity. Although a link to this aspect is sometimes difficult to make, it has been published in several papers, and perhaps these disconnected assessments have been attributed to be the cause of this biodiversity loss, at least partially. So, this has created a loss of trust in the public, which is also a major concern and a need for a change in the paradigm. Continue on the topic of analyzing the current ERA framework for pesticides. Interviewees and workshop participants have identified several strengths and weaknesses. Strengths of the current system were only mentioned by the authorities. The modus operandi, which was highlighted as a general strength, being very clear and logic, allowing the identification of problems and the proposal of mitigation solutions. It was also described as being rather flexible, so it can adapt to new situations. Another point which was highlighted was the data requirements, being quite comprehensive and harmonized, guaranteeing predictability to everybody involved in the process. The process was also been described as being transparent and involving different stakeholders. However, at the same time, this transparency, or the lack of it, was also criticized as a weakness, and it was pointed out by all actors that there is a lack of communication between some relevant stakeholders, especially farmers and public. This links to the lack of involvement in the process from the agronomic and biodiversity conservation sectors. Furthermore, there was a genuine feeling that there is a failure on the process to achieve the regulatory goals which have been described before, especially because of this observed biodiversity loss. This may also be due to the lack of ecological perspective, which does not sufficiently consider the spatial and temporal effects in the indirect toxic effects due to the single substance, single-use assessment which we currently have. Also, it was pointed out that there is a lot of monitoring data which is currently not included in the risk assessment. So, the current system has a lack of knowledge really to describe what is going on in nature, although it was highlighted as a strength that the current system is flexible. It was also described as a weakness that guidelines are outdated and that they are too slow to be up to date. One major criticism is also due to the tiered approach, which was described as making the whole environmental risk assessment rather complex. There is a high amount of very specific data which needs to be assessed, and this was described as a modus operandi that does not help and lead to any realism at the end. Again, based on feedback received during the interviews, on the desk research and on internal discussions, we have made a critical analysis of the current system. It can be defined by these bullet points. It is a product-by-product assessment. We have the perception that when we finish and approve a substance or authorize a product, it has a safe use. And this perception is also tightly linked with the worst-case approach for these individual product-by-product assessments. We also have a tiered ERA methodology and a broad choice of refinement options for the applicants. But at the same time, we have a biodiversity loss, and here we have tried to illustrate how the results and information from monitoring research affects a system defined by these bullet points. So a natural response to this biodiversity loss would be to make more conservative assessments. This, in turn, leads to a higher tiers and increasing demand of data, and by also introducing more sophisticated and detailed methods, which in turn leads to increasing complexity, loss of comparability, increasing the amount of resources spent. But since the current link to the actual measurement and monitoring in the environment for the individual assessment is quite weak, which is one of the major changes that we propose, we still have a prevailing uncertainty of the protectiveness. Due to that, we continue to see the biodiversity loss, leading to a loss of trust and a distract the focus potentially from ERA issues that might be more relevant than the ones in the current framing. And as such, it could become a kind of vicious circle. One important aspect of this view of the current system is that we have this worst case situation and safe use perception, leading to a lack of incentive, we think, for a systemic and holistic retrospective analysis of the ERA and the tools that are being introduced to it. Having all these aspects in mind, and all the information we have collected from the experts consulted, we started to work on the building blocks that would lead us to develop the vision of a systems-based ERA. Environmental risk assessment should be linked to the agronomic reality. Experts pointed out that there are some information which is not currently considered in environmental risk assessment, that there are more data available that we could really integrate for next generation ERA. One obvious point was that we could look at previous environmental risk assessments and try to learn lessons from them, have a more comparative risk assessment based on what we have done in the past. Consider the pesticide usage, the intensity of use, where exactly is the product applied, in which crops. This should all integrate more ecological knowledge, focus at the landscape level, how the crop is cultivated and its special configuration, and also look at the population dynamics on the landscape level. How are the species reproducing and recovering? That is all very much dependent on the landscape structure and not so on the individual field. And as mentioned before, the need to feedback loop with monitoring data. There is a lot of data available describing effects and concentrations in the environment, which were not really considered at the moment. Also, it's important to have risk mitigation measures which are really appropriate on the local level, not on the national level. So if we consider the landscape level, we can suggest more targeted risk mitigation measures, or also look at compensation measures to mitigate effects from pesticide use, or look at alternatives to pesticide use as well. And of course, the whole thing, like it's been described at the very beginning, it's very closely linked to the strategic initiatives. They're really both beginning and the end of the process, as well as the communication with public and farmers. So, when we put all these building blocks together, it was like a storyline which developed. The general suggestion that we got out of these discussions we had with the different experts was that there should be an environmental risk assessment which is linked to the agronomic reality, integrating in the ecology and feedback loop with the monitoring. And finally, the outcome of the risk assessment should really feed into the management and link with the political strategies to reduce pesticide risk. This was the basis that we would see from all these discussions that we had, and that led us to the development of our vision that will be described later on. So, after showing why we need a change in perspective, having assessed the current system and having identified the building blocks that helped us constructing the vision, it's time to present it by answering the question, where to? Counterpointing with the previous slide, where we showed a more fragmented and more linear way of working, this picture shows a shift towards a holistic perspective, where the central element is to shift the perspective of the assessments. In here, the assessors, the yellow little men, providing a basis for decisions, have a broader look at the system as a whole, and also look at the system from a more coordinated and integrated perspective. Another central element here is that the data that comes out would be more useful. This is illustrated with these little coin stacks, representing databases that could be used by other actors. In fact, making the outcome of the assessments available to other actors as open data could, in turn, stimulate knowledge and the development of new tools to facilitate a positive, interactive, and circular way where feedback comes back to the regulatory system in a more systemic and coordinated manner. With the right part of the diagram, we also want to illustrate that the political, economic, and social systems expressed by, for example, protection goals, sustainable use, but also innovation and landscape-adapted agriculture, would need to be more tightly linked to the way regulatory system works. This is still at a very conceptual level, but interconnection between regulators, between data, is a key element here. Although this might feel like a massive job, later we will explain some ways of dividing this mammoth into some small, concrete, and tangible steps that can be taken towards the new direction. While in the previous slide shows a more illustrative thinking of a broader perspective in the regulatory system, here we present a vision focused more on the regulatory era of PPPs. The proposed vision can be pictured as a concentric circular layered ERA process. We have a blue inner circle, which would be a standardized product level ERA focused on key aspects and product specific assessments. We could call it product level ERA, representing a refined version of the current substance by substance assessment process. One could see this as the renewal program, with each blue brick of this circle being a dossier with an ERA for an individual active substance or a product at national level. Of course, we would have new products coming in and, depending on development of knowledge, etc., other products going out of the portfolio of products on the market. In a systems-based era, this process should be focused on comparing and thus distinguishing the impact of different PPPs, increasing comparability and decreasing the assessment complexity, internal benchmarking. In fact, benchmarking ERA tools would be a driver for improved realism and focus on relevant aspects. There would be a need to address questions such as which factors discriminate efficiently between risk levels of different PPPs. Equally important is which factors are more driven by ecosystem properties, and hence more appropriately handled at higher and more integrated level. Therefore, we also propose a surrounding process illustrated here by the dark green circle. This circle supports PPP evaluations and provides ERA with aspects related to landscape and ecosystem levels, with longer timescales and integration of larger datasets, addressing issues related to ecosystem properties currently submitted for substance-specific higher tier assessment. This assessment layer considers landscape scale studies, multiple PPP applications, and monitoring data. Handling these aspects, mostly outside the single dossiers, would improve consistency between assessments and reduce workload, avoiding building just another layer of assessments on the current era. Interconnectivity between the layers is essential and needs to be systematically implemented, for example, as updated assessment factors or generic conditions for use, addressing landscape properties. These are just examples because the green circle is just in the beginning of being developed, but also from the green circle to the blue circle, updated assessment factors could be such a link. The idea here is to learn from the previous era and not to conduct the era in isolation from scratch, but also to consider the agricultural context of the intended use of PPPs. So the dark green and the blue circles will be the core of what we are proposing further on. A third circle, light green, illustrates improved interconnectivity to the agricultural eco and production system. Here, issues related to generic biological and chemical monitoring and the assessment of the necessity of PPP intended uses are dealt with. By integrating different layers, the efforts currently dedicated to the higher tier assessment are conveyed from the product-specific assessment to the integration of information from landscape and agricultural systems. Finally, an outer circle represents the political, economic, and social contexts. On one hand, developments and decisions taken here will affect the specific ERA aspects. On the other hand, the use of the information produced during ERA will be available for more informed decisions and actions at the strategic level to better protect biodiversity, being in line with the farm to fork and biodiversity strategies. The holistic scientific reframing, connecting areas of expertise and data, including other EU strategic partnerships, is proposed as a key driver to facilitate such improvements. So, having presented the developed vision for a systems-based era, the question is now on how to achieve this vision and who needs to be involved. We believe that a scientific reframing of ERA is necessary. That is what we try to exemplify by this picture. On the lower left side, we have what happens in the era of PPPs today. We are currently looking in parallel at many different things with a very high precision and scientific stringency. But does it help to see the bigger picture? Perhaps we do not only have a substance by substance paradigm, but also a risk area by risk area, or even a sub-process by sub-process paradigm. How important is an improved precision in some factor or ecotoxicological value in distinguishing the effect of one PPP on biodiversity at landscape level in relation to another PPP? To promote interconnectivity we talked earlier, we need to understand how things relate to each other. For an holistic perspective, we need to look at the bigger picture. So we propose to helicopter up for a while and use the explorative side of science. Improving comparability between the different parts of the assessment can improve our understanding how they relate to each other. We should use scientific methodology and introduce field data validation of our current system to help determining what is less important, what is more important to focus on, and where a greater strength in the assessment should be given, with the aim of finding a new framing at the higher level, the appropriate level relevant for the regulatory context. And this system must be continuously improved. So we need integrated knowledge and not just little spots, little pieces of knowledge like we have on the left side. Integrated knowledge where we understand how the things work together to a greater extent to do better than we do today. We have to find a new way, a new level to frame the era, to focus on the relevant aspects capturing the impact on biodiversity. To make things a little bit more concrete, a small conceptual illustration of an example on how we could apply an holistic thinking to transform the current system. It is also an example of a concretization of the blue circle and how it could link and be integrated into the landscape context and the green circle. The way we work today, we have first tiers, and several PPPs do not pass the acceptance level. Those are represented by red dots above the horizontal line. So if that happens, we gather more data, work with refinements, and move to higher tiers. So our way of working in ERA is that if a risk estimate is too high to be acceptable, it is refined or safety factors are lowered until it becomes acceptable. This is a perception that we have when considering more data, that the risk estimates could remain at the same level but become acceptable because with the knowledge gained, the level of acceptance is shifted. But in reality, the relative impact of the different PPPs is independent of any refinement or lower safety factor. So, the way that we work today, with a broad range of refinement options, we do not go more than we need for each and every PPP. With the tiered approach, the interconnection and comparability between eras for different PPPs is lost. Another way of looking at what we are doing today is where we have the first tier and we accept a lot of PPPs because we have a higher degree of acceptance to risks. So, what we propose is to make use of a potential understanding of how PPPs relate to each other by exploring a way of using more standardized and holistic assessment. In the picture, they are illustrated by the light green circles as PPPs that passed such a standardized and holistic assessment. But these need to be holistically assessed and approved, authorized, and also, most importantly, managed at landscape level. And linking back to the vision, the upper limit, the orange arrow, could be regularly evaluated and adjusted against monitoring data, tightly linked to reality, establishing the maximum acceptable level of impact for a PPP to be approved or authorized, and then move into the assessment of the green circle. So, having a new standardized holistic assessment could be the basis for a systems-based era that could include more landscape aspects. A standardized and holistic assessment could be more rational and focused on carving out differences in impact level between different PPPs rather than including more detailed descriptions of the ecosystems in each and every dossier. Having seen an example on how this vision could work, we are entering now in the last phase of this presentation, the transition itself and the way that we suggest reaching the change and the shift in perspective that we have outlined before. So, in this slide we would like to wrap up and indicate where we are, to show the steps that the PERA-project team has taken in order not to overlook things that are important and will block, at the end, a transition to a systems-based approach. Starting from the bottom with the exchange with the relevant actors on the different aspects from the theme paper of EFSA, the changes and the needs of the future era were identified. The same for the building blocks relevant for the future approaches already moving up into the transition. This was followed by the development of a vision for a systems-based era using a co-creation approach with different stakeholders. And in the last slides, we have briefly described the scientific approach that is possibly needed to reframe era questions. Knowing that the transition to a systems-based era is not an easy task, we are aware of potential challenges and blockers. These will be presented in the next slide, followed by the proposed strategy to overcome these challenges and blockers and enable the transition. As mentioned, the shift in paradigm that this transition towards the systems-based era represents will face several potential challenges and blockers. The ones mentioned here were indicated in the interviews, in the desk research, and also in the workshops. So one main challenge was what a systems-based approach would mean. The definition was perceived as unclear, especially regarding the complexity, mainly when including social and economic aspects. Also challenging is how a trade-off between environmental protection and food production would be achieved in such a systems-based approach. The inclusion of other factors in a systems-based approach will possibly increase the complexity, also perceived as a blocker for the transition, and then, as a consequence, lead to increase the uncertainty in the outcome of environmental risk assessment. One big challenge that needs to be overcome is in the transition to a next generation era is the perceived lack of communication and involvement of relevant stakeholders. Many stakeholders would like to be involved or informed, at least, at the beginning of the processes when, for example, guidance documents are set up and especially during their development. This was particularly emphasized in the case of agronomists and nature conservationists, that their knowledge is not duly considered in the process. This connects to the next point, agronomy. It was perceived as a challenge that would need to include more the context of the farming system. Remember that farmers are the ultimate users of PPPs and are heavily affected by the outcome of the risk assessment. As for perceived blockers, increasing complexity and how the future era will look like with the inclusion of other factors in the process was highlighted. Here it was perceived as helpful that the environmental risk assessment of active substances and plant protection products itself, related to the comparative assessment, should be simpler so that the complexity overall would not increase. Harmonization could be a blocker if a systems-based approach is adopted only in some regulation but not in others. So in this case, harmonization would not be possible. For example, if we consider the one substance, one assessment, which is in principle also a systems-based approach, this is also overarching between different legal frameworks. The legal framework itself is, of course, not a blocker. It was only indicated that the changes or the steps towards the changes need to start in the legal framework that we have now and that we will have possibly in the future. Some amendments regarding the type of work that needs to be done and possibly the responsibilities between stakeholders needs to be discussed, but it is possible to take a systems-based approach in the current framework. We have defined three main blocks for a proposed strategy for the transition. They have equal importance and they are not consecutive. They just have different focus. One part of the strategy should focus on the implementation of the long-term goals of a systems-based era. Although not easy, it is important that we commit to these goals. It is important to prioritize and define which are the important steps, and commit to the goal in every single decision that is taken, and to check for the compliance with the long-term goal of having a systems-based approach. Our suggestion is to start with small steps that are tangible and that are implementable in the current framework. These are short-term actions that can be undertaken now. Of course, all these should be aligned and interact with the legal development so it can be fully implemented. As mentioned before, procedures and responsibilities between stakeholders may have to be adapted for a full implementation of a systems-based ERA, implying the need for possible legislative changes, but these could be a more long-term activity. The second block of activities for the transition is of course the engagement with the stakeholders. We have seen that communication is a focus. The creation of PERA, the Partnership for Environmental Risk Assessment, will be a major factor that will influence the success of the transition. Ownership and engagement of stakeholders will also enable tailored solution and also the feeling of being involved from the beginning. As mentioned before, there are necessary research scoping activities to link also the different parts of the vision and NAM Year 3. Learn from previous ERA to compare and rank pesticides, not starting from the scratch. Then, how to integrate monitoring data in ERA. And then, how to relate the outcome of ERA to what is happening in the field. Assess the effect holistically because the organisms in the field are then exposed also to different stressors or to different regulated products. Moving now to the proposed multidisciplinary projects that we suggest implementing for the transition to a systems-based ERA, we present here an outline showing how the different projects are connected. These have both long-term and short-term objectives, and they are planned to run in parallel and to interlink. Project 1, the big orange box, development and implementation of a systems-based approaches in ERA, has an overarching and integrative role in guiding the specific scientific and technical developments within other projects. Under this overarching project, we have a more organizational project, Project 2, that is focused on the development of the PERA partnership itself. So this is really to technically enable the partnership and engage the stakeholders over a long period of time, as you see by the arrow that goes outside the time frame. The partnership will persist in time, scoping also to the future and taking up, for example, upcoming problems that we cannot foresee today. The next 3 blocks are projects proposed to develop the concepts, methods and tools to enable the transition. The first one, Project 3, mentions develop comparability between environmental risk assessment of PPPs. Relates more to the blue circle in the vision that you might remember relates to the environmental risk assessment of single active substance or of single products. The next 2 projects, 4 and 5, will have the aim of leading to a more systems-based approach, also including the relationship with the landscape and the context in the field. All projects are starting together, and Project 1 ensures that the outcomes of the different projects, and especially the links to the PERA framework, are very tight, so that they can be combined as a proof of concept that is also foreseen in Project 1. The next 2 slides present a very short description of the different projects. The aim of Project 1 is to empower the transition to a systems-based approach in environmental risk regulation via a strategic and scientific governance. It sets out to ensure transparency and integrity of scientific contributions to a systems-based ERA. Moreover, it aims at connecting science, data and knowledge from ERA to high-level use strategies. It focuses also on the prioritization of steps for the development of such an overarching framework that even if the project starts, for example, on the basis of PPPs, the framework is constructed in a way that can be used, for example, for other regulated products, or even include other stressors. So here, we could focus on questions like, what is a systems-based approach? What does the system science says about boundaries? How big, how simple or complex does it need to be? Project 2 is really crucial for bringing together stakeholders and for building the PERA platform for systems-based ERA. It will focus not only on cooperation, communication, and engaging the right stakeholders. Crucial is trust among stakeholders on this process to create the capacity and the willingness to this transition, and also through a continuous co-development of the vision. But this project also deals with the implementation of concrete steps for the PERA development. How is the platform built and how does it work? Who owns and who pays for it? Who is in control and how is the PERA platform observed? Projects 3 and 5 are more dedicated scientific projects to the building blocks for the next generation environmental risk assessment. Project 3 focuses on the comparability between the ERA of pesticides and how this can be done. Also focuses on the development of a database that is available to a risk assessor and a risk manager for a comparable and simplified ERA. Toxicity data, pesticide use data, how are crops being set up, how are they managed, which are pesticides with higher inputs and crops with higher pesticide inputs, and so on, is data that can be used in the integrated assessment. This will increase the relevance and reusability of ERA data and expertise, so we don't have to start from scratch with every single substance. Project 4 focuses on the ecology and the monitoring data that could be biological and chemical monitoring data, but also could be pre- and post-registration data. The results of this project will help informing the risk assessment on the status of the system and to identify upcoming risks. They can also indicate if the mitigation measures in place are effective, for example, at landscape level, and also provide a feedback to ERA on the fulfillment of protection goals. If we just think about protecting biodiversity, the monitoring will help close the loop that is also foreseen in the legislation between prospective and retrospective assessment. Project 5 has the aim to holistically assess the impact of chemicals in agricultural production systems. It provides the basis for integrated assessments by developing regulatory applicable and relevant tools for systems-based risk assessment of PPPs and other chemical stressors, as well as management practices. Mechanistic model development is envisaged as well as validation studies in order to identify relevant scales for integrated system-level assessments. The scientific outcome of this project will support reducing the use of PPPs in general and improving ecosystem resilience in agricultural production and ecosystems. And to finalize, after presenting the work developed by the PERA-project team with a proposed strategy for the transition to a systems-based ERA, a final message on why we believe it's important for EFSA to embrace this transition. First of all, this transition and the aims of a systems-based approach are included in EFSA's strategic goals. Secondly, we believe that it will strengthen EFSA's position in fulfilling the aims of the Green Deal and associated strategies. By leading PERA, or being a major player in the partnership, EFSA will be in the front row and will have a strategic role in shaping the transition to a systems-based ERA, having an important role in strategic governance and in defining common and holistic protection goals will allow EFSA to connect different projects and initiatives, either within EFSA but also between EFSA and other stakeholders. And also important, appearing here as a flagged point, it will allow EFSA to consolidate different methodologies in ERA. Embracing the transition will further help EFSA bringing more and more environmental issues into ERA by taking monitoring data and use it to improve the risk assessment outcomes, as mentioned before. This will increase the agility to act when necessary, also flagged here. And finally, an aspect that is in the DNA of EFSA, embracing the transition will allow EFSA to increase communication, transparency and trust of the ERA process, to show how environmental concerns are taken up in ERA, thus making environmental risk assessment more transparent to the general public and especially to those involved with the use of pesticides, namely farmers. And this was the final message. On behalf of the entire PERA-project team, I would like to acknowledge all the EFSA colleagues that supported this project and provided insightful discussions, particularly those from the EFSA SPEEDO team. A special thank you to all the colleagues that accepted to be interviewed and to participate in the 2 PERA workshops. Their input was of paramount importance for the project. So, a big thank you to you all.